We wanted to start with just some personal questions, get to know a little bit about you and how you came to this work. So why don't we start there? How did you get into housing law and becoming an evictions expert?
Even before I went to law school, I was working at a legal aid office, actually in Connecticut. And from that early point in my introduction to the legal field, it was so clear that housing was paramount to livelihood, that it was one of the pillars of resiliency. And I was working on collecting evidence around housing code violations and conditions issues. And so I would go into families' homes and take pictures of mold and infestations and other problems. And everyone was sick and everyone needed legal assistance to remedy those problems and those things were causing their illness. And so that really inspired a legal career where I started working with families who are homeless in Washington, D.C., and saw firsthand the extent of harm that eviction and housing displacement causes for families, and how homelessness itself can take a whole year just to get out of the shelter system and sets you on that downward trajectory of poor health and barriers to opportunity and so on. And so all of those experiences have really led to this moment of understanding the injustice in the eviction system itself, the imbalance of power, and the extreme harm that families and individuals face for as little as being a few dollars behind or a few days late on the rent.
I know you've kind of worked at the intersection of public health, law, and poverty. Could you talk about how you see those three kind of relating to each other in your current role as chair of the American Bar Association's COVID-19 Task Force Committee?
Public health and housing and poverty are deeply connected. The social and legal determinants of health are often connected to housing, and poverty itself and socioeconomic status can set you off on a poor health trajectory. Poverty itself is a social determinant of poor health, and the conditions of poverty often lead to poor health outcomes for families and individuals who are facing economic instability or distress. And public health laws are able to regulate many of the conditions of poverty, like substandard housing conditions, the environments that people live in. And housing law is also implicated here in terms of the historic effects of redlining and how we're investing in communities. So all of these fields are connected, and in the same way that social issues are, that they are a Gordian knot, and you cannot isolate them and expect to unravel it, that you have to look at the whole. And this is one of the reasons that I think in the pandemic, public health and the link with poverty and housing in particular has become so clear and highlighted and underscored in so many ways. And we're seeing how when we don't address these issues and when we don't think about the public health consequences of laws that either perpetuate poverty and poor health or that could remedy them, if we're not looking at all of these links, we will end up actually propelling the crisis itself. One of the areas that I focus on pretty heavily is health justice. And this is really an attempt to try and understand the social roots of health inequity, and trying to address subordination of historically marginalized groups, especially people of color, people in poverty, from a health justice framework, which looks at the discrimination both on a structural and systemic and interpersonal level, but also the laws and policies and the systems that are in place because of that discrimination and that subordination. And how can we empower individuals most affected by these issues to shift that cycle into one of health protectiveness, and that actually furthers good health and gives people access to opportunity. Because we cannot hold that society is just if only a select few have access to opportunity. And that access, the key to access, is health. And right now, a large proportion of the population, tens of millions of people who are in poverty, below the poverty line and facing poverty and homelessness and poor housing and on from there, do not have that level of access because of all these barriers that are connected to these issues.
So, there's specific laws, so we've talking about eviction protections, but are there other, general places where housing stability intersects with legal protections?
I mean, the whole system.
Fair enough.
I mean, this is one of the reasons that law is truly a determinant of health. You literally can't cross the street without walking through a law or some sort of regulation that's governing and dictating your behavior. And in the same way, law determines the type, the quality, the access to housing. And so if we don't have laws that are protective in place, we end up with entire segments of the housing market that have substandard conditions that are located in areas of low opportunity and little access to employment or to transportation even, and even food and good performing schools and lower crime neighborhoods. And so all of this is largely linked to the laws and policies that allow for the current substandard housing, the lack of affordable housing to exist. And if we can shift that cycle to one of protectiveness, to one that really evaluates health in all policies and racial equity in all policies and looks for those unintended consequences, and in some places intended, and remedies them, we can ensure that the housing field, that housing law generally is working for everyone, and that we have this access to safe and decent housing, which truly does not exist for a large portion of the population today. So we see law influencing how the housing field in the conditions in which people live, where housing itself is located, and the environments and the health of those environments, whether or not you have access to housing either through the affordability of it or through discriminatory practices or retaliation, and protecting against those things, and on from there. And it lands us eventually to the court systems themselves and how they process evictions and other access issues related to housing.
You mentioned the role of courts, and I had read an article recently from the New York Times that talked about one of the problems with the recent CDC eviction moratorium is kind of the inconsistency in how a lot of judges are interpreting the CDC moratorium. Could you talk about that issue a bit more on why there's such a, I guess, like a variety of interpretations among judges?
So the CDC moratorium is a really good example of where public health and housing intertwine. And it is a pandemic mitigation strategy designed to keep people in their homes so that we can control the spread of COVID-19 infection, death, transmission. And that is only effective if it's consistently interpreted across jurisdictions, and if it's implemented uniformly, and if it's enforced. And it also requires that tenants understand their rights, because they are the only individuals who can trigger protection under the moratorium. And right now, across the country, we're seeing varied interpretations of the moratorium itself from the courts, and as well as from property owners and their willingness to accept the declaration, and sheriffs on the end of the system who are charged with executing orders of eviction. And so in some jurisdictions, we have very protective courts who have determined that presenting a declaration of protection under the moratorium will stop the filing of the eviction itself. So keeping it off the record, keeping you out of the court system. Whereas in other jurisdictions, they'll allow the process to proceed all the way to the execution of the order, and halting it right there, as opposed to earlier in the process, which gives you more time to collect rent relief, to avoid a judgment, to avoid that scarlet E on your record. And still, we also have judges in Georgia, for example, who have determined that the CDC moratorium, in their opinion, is unconstitutional, which contravenes higher level court decisions that have already decided the constitutionality of the CDC moratorium, that it is a necessary measure during the pandemic, and that it is not infringing on any constitutional rights. And so the various interpretations of this order have led to this inconsistent implementation, and really eroded the order itself and limited the effectiveness of the order and the moratorium in preventing the spread of COVID-19. One of the issues with eviction and that system is how different jurisdictions practice eviction law, and what the law. So let's say that again. Uh, the the eviction system and the laws governing eviction are determined state by state, and they even vary sometimes from county to county. In some states, magistrate judges who only need a high school diploma are deciding those cases, whereas in other states or cities, the court is overseen by a judge who has to have a law degree, and their only practice is housing law. So it's incredibly different across the country, and everything from how easy it is to file a case to the extent of due process that a tenant receives in that actual adjudication itself.
Do you have ideas about what could be done at the federal level to deal with this inconsistency so that something crucial for public health like the CDC eviction moratorium could be enforced more consistently?
So how to enforce the CDC moratorium?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So when the moratorium was first issued, it was very broad. It appeared to apply to all stages of eviction and to the vast majority of tenants facing non-payment of rent eviction. And in October, a month after it was issued, the CDC issued guidance, an FAQ, that really eroded those protections and allowed landlords to file cases and to be heard, and allowed landlords to challenge the veracity of a declaration. And so this had the effect of turning eviction court into a perjury trial. And that is incredibly harmful and incredibly intimidating for tenants, and has a chilling effect on an individual's willingness to actually exercise their rights under that moratorium to stay safe during the pandemic. And it also, I think, led to loopholes and violations of the moratorium as well. So how do we fix that? The CDC and Congress can correct that immediately by rescinding the FAQ, which does not have the force of law. It should only be considered by courts when there's a question on the face of the order, and there isn't. The order itself is extremely clear. And so, but how to correct that? Because the reality is that it's being misinterpreted. To make it clear that the CDC moratorium applies to all evictions, to all stages of eviction, so that it should stop the initiation of the eviction itself, because we know that pre-pandemic, in one study, over 30% of tenants vacate their unit at the first sign of eviction. So this means that if we allow those filings to go forward, we will still see the spread of COVID-19, because tenants they don't want to engage with the court system. The writing is on the wall, and they will start doubling up with friends and family, be transient and unable to comply with pandemic mitigation protocol. So first, make sure that the moratorium applies to all renters, to all stages of eviction, but it should also apply to all evictions that would result in that tenant being transient and doubling up and living in overcrowded environments. Right now, we're seeing many property owners use another reason beyond non-payment to move forward with the eviction that's truly based on lack of rent payments for a period of time. And such as holdovers, where you are staying beyond the lease period, or some lease violation that would have been overlooked in pre-pandemic times when there was no moratorium in place. And so that level of protectiveness is certainly necessary in light of the increase in using loopholes to move forward with the case, and also the spike in self-help or extrajudicial evictions that we're seeing across the country and globally.
Yep. What sort of enforcement power could the federal government bring to bear if, a judge continues to let evictions proceed in clear violation of the order?
Especially in light of some of the most egregious cases, such as Georgia, where the magistrates are sua sponte declaring the unconstitutionality of the moratorium, the Department of Justice needs to enforce that order and ensure that these states are adopting it. We also have situations where the vast majority of states, about 46 states, have yet to formally adopt the CDC moratorium in the state. If a governor issues an order adopting the moratorium in the state, then there's no question that it has applied in that state and that the CDC does have authority in that jurisdiction. So that is another way to increase enforcement opportunities, because then the state attorney general can also get involved, which they can do at this stage, that they already have the authority to do that and to ensure that we don't have self-help evictions, that we don't have people skirting the law to try and regain access to their property solely because people have been hard hit by the pandemic. So enforcement is a major piece of this. Another piece is education, that tenants must know their rights going into the process, that in many states, the moratorium is being used largely as an affirmative defense that you raise after the case has been filed. And that requires that a tenant be knowledgeable about how to do that and when in the process to do that, and that is their right to do so as well. In addition, because so much of this has to do with affirmative defenses and this complicated legal system, it's critical to have legal representation. We know that in cities that have a civil right to counsel in housing court, that evictions are reduced dramatically. They go from the majority of people being evicted who are unrepresented to 84% of people who are represented avoiding eviction. So the fact of the shift in outcomes truly demonstrates the inequity in this system, the injustice and the bias inherent in the system, and the need for legal representation to rectify that tilt.
Are there any executive orders that you think President Biden could make that would help in mitigating the current eviction crisis?
Or other actions?
I think there are a number of executive orders that have already been issued that could be levers to address the eviction crisis. For example, the new administration, one of the first executive orders that was signed was about racial equity in underserved communities. And eviction is exactly that. We see the opposite of that across the country in low-income communities and communities of color, that the inequity inherent in housing and in eviction, it's affecting people of color at dramatically higher rates, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. That right now, Black households are telling the US Census that they are at risk of not being able to pay their rent at twice the rate of white households in this moment during the pandemic. And pre-pandemic, Black households were also 2 times as likely to be evicted than white households, even after controlling for education. And this phenomenon affects Black women and families at the highest rates. And so that executive order about achieving racial equity in underserved communities is directly implicated in this issue as well. And then the executive order directing the CDC to extend the moratorium has also been adhered to and adopted. And now it's a matter of ensuring that that executive order is realized, that the goal of the executive order is realized by this widespread implementation that's uniform, by enforcement, by education, and expanding it to all forms of eviction. I think what we really need in this moment is direction from Congress. Congress has the authority to extend the moratorium for the duration of the pandemic, to ensure that households receive rental assistance to cover the back rent owed and to make up the rent burden. 70% of low-income households are paying more than 30% of their income toward rent. And that was when they had income to do that. And so now that rent burden is going to be spiraling beyond control. So there are a number of actions that can take place, but the most important in this moment is a uniform moratorium that applies to all evictions across the country and to all renters who are at risk of displacement and doubling up in transiency. And at the same time, rental assistance to ensure that when this crisis is over, we aren't walking into a proliferated affordable housing crisis and homelessness crisis throughout the country.
Do you have thoughts or opinions about the best and most equitable way to approach spending the rent assistance money that we have?
I think first, as a country, we have to dedicate more funds to addressing the eviction crisis. It's estimated that tenants owe upwards of $100 billion in back rent, and we only have $25 billion earmarked for both rent and utility debt, which utility debt is extremely high right now. So that $25 billion is only going to make a dent in the need. And how effective it is depends entirely on how committed states are to dispersing that fund, that the funds that they receive in a deliberate and equitable way. Many of the states across the country did not have robust rental assistance or rent relief programs before the pandemic. So they are building them from scratch, which means that they don't have inroads into the communities that need them the most. And if they learned anything from the CARES Act and the CRF funding that was allocated and some of the failings of those programs where the bar was set too high, and so they had excess funds that they'd never actually dispersed to the community, or the bar was set very low and they ran out of funding within hours, which is where we should be. We need to get that funding into the communities as quickly as possible to prevent the most harm. And these health harms will last well into the future if we don't stop the crisis now. A couple of the best practices for rental assistance programs, ensuring that the barrier to entry is very low, that there are not rigorous requirements for eligibility and proof of eligibility, that the bar doesn't create some sort of deterrent for people who are extremely marginalized or who might be undocumented, that these are some of the families and individuals who will be targeted the most and at the highest risk of extreme harm. So the low eligibility bar is the first step. And then the second is really identifying community partners, trusted community partners that the community works with already and that knows where to find the hardest hit renters and how to get the funds to them quickly. So that's a very critical component of this. Another piece of it too, we know where people are hardest hit. It's the same communities that have been ignored and overlooked for decades. And we know which ones those are. It's the communities with the lowest incomes, with the highest poverty rates, with the least amount of access to opportunity, and with the highest communities, the highest population of color. And so we can target our funds into those communities first to really build them back up and ensure that they're not at risk of displacement in the way that they are right now. Another approach is to also partner with the courts themselves. So ensuring that before a landlord can file, that they have identified the rental assistance programs and given that information to their tenant. And in some places, and the federal law allows this, the landlord can apply themselves for that rental assistance and receive it directly. And so making sure that the courts are aware of that information and become one of the delivery systems so that the rental assistance gets to the people who are the closest to that eviction system itself. Even if Congress allocates all of the funds that are critical in this moment to prevent the current crisis, that's not going to be enough to address the underlying affordable housing crisis. That coming into this pandemic, we had stagnant wages for decades. The lowest income wages actually lost 5% of their income. We had stagnant wages for the middle class. We had rising rents with few states with rent caps. And we had a dearth of investment on the part of the federal government into affordable housing. And we also lost 4 million affordable housing units in the decade leading into the pandemic. So unless we have a commitment to addressing those root causes and actually investing in communities who entered the pandemic in a deficit, we will not address the looming harm and this ominous crisis and catastrophe that we are on the brink of seeing in the future.
On the topic of eligibility, do you think it's better to have broader eligibility to cover everybody or to target the limited resources to people who need it the most?
I think we need more resources. I think that the approach has to be to cover anyone who's at risk of eviction. That the harm associated with eviction, in addition to COVID-19 infection and mortality, and let's be clear that the people who are facing eviction also have the highest rates of comorbidities that if they contracted COVID-19 would result in complications and higher rates of death. So the people facing eviction right now are at higher risk of COVID-19 mortality than other populations because of those existing conditions that we see in lower income populations and people who had the low wages and the job loss. So we need to cover everyone. That has to be our standard of practice. The federal stimulus did put parameters on where to start, and they did require that states prioritize people who had lower incomes, who were at higher risk of eviction, who had greater back rent owed, as the first round, and then with the supplemental funds broadening from there. I think that's the general approach that's being taken right now because it's mandated.
A lot of nonprofit housing providers are also in an interesting situation here, right? Many of them, they don't want to evict. They've came out early and said, we understand this is important, but they're also, as you noted, they're important to the affordable housing system. There's not enough of them, and they at some point need to keep their organizations afloat. And many of them are creating payment plans for their back rent, which is not necessarily ideal if folks were already paying just what they could afford. Do you have thoughts about the role of nonprofit housing providers in this ecosystem in terms of rent relief or strategies that they have access to fulfill their mission and keep themselves afloat?
I'm not sure. What are they? What is the greatest issue that they're facing? That they don't have the funds, that they might not be able to offer housing? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, at some point, if they don't get enough rent in, they will, they have mortgage obligations, they have utilities, et cetera, as nonprofit housing providers, and they don't want to lose, if they have to sell their buildings, they don't want to lose the affordability restrictions on those buildings. They're not at that point yet. They were afraid last spring they might get there. It's gone better than expected, but it may at some point. They're definitely facing that tension as mission-oriented, essentially landlords.
Don't most of the nonprofit housing providers also receive federal funds?
Many of them do, or but not all. Certainly, they may be operating. The ones who have voucher tenants, they're good because the vouchers adjust with income. But for an operator of just a low-income housing tax credit property, there's no ongoing subsidy to that property or support.
Yeah. So there is a real risk that without federal intervention in the form of funding, in the form of tax breaks and moratoriums on foreclosure and other issues related to the ability to provide housing itself, either as a private landlord or as a nonprofit landlord or a federally funded one, it's critical that Congress include that type of response and that population in the solution, or we will see a reduction in affordable housing in the housing market, even beyond what has already happened in the last decade. And that without that housing, there is no other outcome beyond widespread homelessness doubling up. This pillar of resiliency is completely wiped out. So I'm starting to see the federal government include in proposals more relief for property owners, for nonprofit housing owners, for individual owners, to try and address this looming issue of taking these units off the market and being forced to evict the tenants. Yeah, unfortunately, there's not. I mean, it really comes down to our budget and what is the federal government going to do. Right now, the fate of the housing market and the long-term health and well-being of renters across the country is resting on the shoulders of the people hardest hit by the pandemic. And we can't expect them to carry that burden, that this has to be a nationwide commitment to addressing the eviction crisis and the underlying affordable housing crisis and supporting the housing providers, as well as buoying the tenants who need that support so critically right now. And that requires a federal commitment. And in that way, our budget is a moral, ethical document, and we will be deciding what the country actually stands for.
What are your opinions on what we should be changing about the system after the pandemic? Eviction was, like you said, already a pre-pandemic issue. Are there any ways you think we should change the housing court and eviction system long term?
Oh, yeah. So I think we have two issues, parallel issues that are facing housing and the health of the housing market as well as the people who live in it. So the two parallel track issues are the affordability of housing, the health of housing, and then the eviction system itself. And they're really separate issues. The affordable housing issue is born of the lack of racial equity and support for underserved communities. It is directly linked to decades of racially discriminatory housing laws and policies that were left to stand and their aftermath left unaddressed. We can directly attribute the lack of wealth accumulation, the lack of homeownership, the lack of opportunity for communities of color across the country, and why during the pandemic, when crisis struck, they were unable to tap into a safety net to survive even just a month of hardship. So we have to address that affordable housing crisis, which is largely attributed to those stagnant wages, rising rents, and lack of federal investment. That's also going to require that the government-sponsored enterprises start investing in those communities. They were responsible for the current market conditions, and they are responsible for ensuring that racial disparities in asset accumulation are addressed. And that means that mortgage lending and the siting of homes must become a priority. So that affordable housing crisis is that first issue. Then the second, let me go back to affordable housing for a second. The other piece of affordable housing is ensuring that all of these different sectors that have any kind of nexus with housing and community development be engaged. And that we look to unlikely partners, from healthcare institutions to larger lenders, to really start investing in communities where they haven't traditionally thought of them as the patient or as the client. And then on the eviction system itself, we have an eviction system that, for just being a few days or a few dollars late on your rent, can result in severe poor health outcomes, even take years off of your life. It can cause adverse outcomes for pregnancy, low birth weight, early term pregnancies. It leads to increased violence for women. One eviction usually means that you will have multiple evictions and future housing precarity. So all of this, that harm, is due to this singular event of being caught up in that eviction system. And the system itself is being abused, and it is being used largely as a debt court, where landlords are using it to control behavior, to remind tenants to pay rent, even if they're just a day late, and that they'll file cases against them multiple times. So we have this serial filing phenomenon that ends up increasing rents for tenants and placing them at even further housing precarity. So this system itself has to be addressed, that so many of the solutions that we are placing on it right now are band-aids. The right to counsel is a response to the inequity in the system. The system itself is inequitable, so any of these solutions will not address that harm unless we take a look at the underlying issues. And a big part of that is this power imbalance. And while the eviction, our landlord tenant laws are descendants of feudal law, where tenants had no rights other than to pay the rent, and landlords enjoyed the ability to be free from tort immunity. They could rent to whoever they want. They could discriminate. They could engage in self-help eviction. They could provide uninhabitable units, and the tenant would accept that harm and that harmful condition. And so today, while we have had a revolution in landlord-tenant law and more protections for tenants, we have a long way to go. It's too easy to file an eviction case, and our eviction system, which was originally designed to allow the property owner to recoup the property, is now largely a debtor court that is resulting in so much harm and this downward spiral and this never-ending cycle of disparity. I feel like I really rambled there. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. That was great. It's really important because we need to be looking. That's fine.
I mean, the other piece of this is in almost every jurisdiction across the country, a landlord can file to evict for no reason. That at the end of your lease term, they only need to give you 30 days notice to evict you. And that is a mask for discrimination, for retaliation, and can really lead to a wide level of injustice. And we really need to start thinking about eviction prevention, diversion programs, How do we ensure that we have just cause evictions where there has to be a legitimate reason for evicting a tenant to protect against discrimination and that type of retaliation that's so widespread? And also clean hands policies, that you should not be allowed to evict a tenant from your unit if that unit is not habitable, if it does not comply with housing code and sanitation code, that you are actually delivering a home that is livable in order to be able to engage in that eviction process. At the same time, the phenomenon of the Scarlet E is so harmful and damaging. And the fact that an eviction is a legal record, that no matter the outcome of the case, even if a tenant wins, it is still searchable for a long period of time. And it haunts that tenant when they're trying to put their life back together, and pushes them to the outskirts of the rental market because landlords will screen out tenants who have an eviction on their record. It even precludes a tenant from public housing. Public housing authorities will often screen them out. So people who are the most in need of assistance are blocked from that solely because they were engaged in the eviction system. And again, it may just be for that small amount of rent owed and was solely for the reminder that your rent was due. And so we have to start redacting the record, sealing records, ensuring that this can't haunt a tenant and truly destroy their lives, to set them off on this downward trajectory that they will be very hard pressed to recover from.
You've mentioned, and we started at the beginning talking about the health justice connection here. And as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of health systems, health players, hospitals, and insurers who have started to see the health and housing connection, who've been putting investment into affordable housing on the supply side. Can you talk a little bit about, have you seen any of them also move into sticking up for policy, for better policy, because clearly their interests would also be aligned with improving the eviction system if their goal is to improve overall health? Can you talk a little about if you've seen any of that, and why a hospital system might want to engage in supporting changes to eviction policy?
I think the medical and public health fields are extremely well versed in the health connection with housing, that they recognize the overwhelming evidence demonstrates that eviction leads to severe poor health outcomes, from higher mortality rates, from respiratory distress to cardiac disease, to drug use, STDs, to depression, anxiety, mental health issues, suicide. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's no good outcome from eviction and from housing instability. And especially for children, we're seeing a lot of pediatricians really engage in housing, that they recognize the link between eviction and an increase in lead poisoning, which results in permanent brain damage, in respiratory disease, in academic decline, in food insecurity. So all of these pillars of childhood that allow a child to thrive and grow are stripped from them. And so in response to that, we see providers testifying at city council hearings. A group of about 24 medical associations and public health associations across the country filed an amicus brief in the challenges to the CDC moratorium at the federal level. And so they're certainly well aware and well versed in these issues. And I think that's part of the reason why we see more health care providers, more hospitals treating the community as the patient and investing in housing. But we need to keep moving in that direction. I think that there can be much more advocacy and outreach in that regard. The other piece where I'm seeing a lot of this is in the increase in medical legal partnerships. Many of those medical legal partnerships where a lawyer is integrated into the healthcare team focus heavily on housing, especially housing conditions and eviction prevention. So in that area, we're also seeing that recognition and that training happening to really build up this response. I do think that healthcare providers are crucial to achieving the policy change that's necessary in this area, that policymakers, they will listen to healthcare providers, that they are an authority on this topic. And so when they present these issues, there are results.
what do you think the national conversation around housing stability and eviction will be now that we're starting to move out of the pandemic? Do you think that the way we're talking about housing as a health issue, do you think that'll endure past COVID?
It's hard for me to say because I've always seen it as a health issue. It's always been so clear to me that unstable and unhealthy housing is directly linked to poor health outcomes and a person's ability to thrive and access opportunity. So it's been incredibly encouraging to see that link elevated to such a high level during the pandemic, and the recognition that housing is healthcare, housing is health, be widely accepted. So hopefully this will shift our understanding of the importance of housing to all of these other areas of life and how deeply linked they are. But what time will tell.
Do you think there's anything that housing advocates can do to keep it like in the public eye as a major issue?
Well, the other piece of the pandemic that I've noticed is housing advocates are using health-based arguments much more frequently and seeing success because of that, seeing the positive outcomes and the positive reception by the courts and other parties. And so it is my hope that this will continue, that we will start to integrate that into our practice of law in this area into the future as well. Yeah, I mean, when I directed a health justice clinic in Chicago, many of our cases were eviction cases, and we had 100% positive outcome. And in each case, we were able to get the security deposit and back rent to the tenant because of the conditions of those units. And we have the medical provider testify on behalf of those tenants, demonstrating the link between housing and the conditions that the tenants were suffering from. And so it is really shifting the practice in this area as well. And part of that is educating the judiciary about all of the connections between housing and health, and how this is so much more than just the back rent owed.
Absolutely. So just one, little small question to finish up. You've become kind of a national spokesperson on evictions this year, right? How does that feel? What has that been like for you? I don't know. It seems like it to me. I see, you've shown up in a lot of places.
Well, can I back up first before I answer that question?
Yeah, sure.
One thing I wanted to, you asked earlier, how do we fix the eviction system? I just want to follow up on that, because I think it has become so clear over the course of the pandemic that housing is a matter of livelihood. It is a matter of health. It is a matter of the life longevity and our ability to access every area of society, from education, employment, social services, social networks, and on from there. And ensuring stable housing has to be a national priority. And a part of that means really considering the right to housing. And this is not revolutionary. We have multiple countries across the world, from France to Scotland to South Africa, who have a right to housing, where homelessness in Scotland, for example, is a phenomenon. It is something that doesn't happen very often. And when it does, it's rare and it's short in time duration. And so we need to start thinking about that in the United States as part of our federal intervention, this right to safe and decent housing across the country that's been denied for a large proportion of the population for far too long, and something that we've promised people for decades. In 1944, the Economic Bill of Rights included the right to stable housing. And in 1949, the Housing Act set as the national goal the realization, as soon as feasible, of the right to a safe and decent home for every family in the country. I'd say this many years later, it's about time those rights are realized. So that has to be part of our examination and our consideration as we think about how to address these dual crises. And if we don't, we're just setting ourselves up for further failure and further public health crises in the future. But in terms of the other question, so don't know that I'm a spokesperson so much as someone who sees an injustice and feels compelled to speak out, knowing that we all have to use our voices if we are ever to fully expect change in our society and equality across all people and equity, both among health and race and housing. And there's a time when people are so hard hit that their voices are stamped out. And that's when the rest of us need to get louder until they recover and can join us in that fight and in elevating their own voices, so that we're standing side by side, and that the culmination of all of these people together demanding that change will finally realize it. So in terms of, I think we're all called to be spokespeople, especially when the level of injustice is so apparent. Once you become aware of the hardship that other people are facing, you're duty bound to stand up and respond. Not one person should be seated. Not one person should be silent in these moments. It's not hard to get motivated. All I need to do is tuck my kids in at night and think about the other mom who's tucking her kids in and wondering where they're going to sleep tomorrow. I can't imagine being in that situation, let alone in a pandemic. That level of injustice, that level of hardship should be unacceptable in our country. And I don't plan on sitting down or silencing until it is. Gosh, I have so much more to say on like what do we all need to be doing? Well, I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves as a nation, what do we stand for? Do we stand for humanity? Do we stand for the interconnectedness of all of our lives, which I think the pandemic has made so clear, that each of us depends on one another to stay healthy and survive this. And that's no different than pre or post-pandemic times, that our lives are intricately connected, as well as our well-being, that I cannot realize what I ought to be in this world unless you do as well. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we going to subject our children to inequality, and are we going to steal their futures along with this eviction crisis just as they're getting started? Or are we going to stand in the way and stop callously turning families out on the street solely because they were hard hit by the pandemic and couldn't bear the weight of it? No one can be expected to do that. And so today, I think we finally have to look this issue in the face and redress housing precarity, redress the long-standing discriminatory nature of our laws and policies, and clean up the mess that created, and really repair the harm that has been pushed onto so many people and so many generations. And if we don't, we can expect the outgrowth of this to affect generations long into the future. I think if we're ever to call our society humane or just, and we are all responsible for that, we won't hesitate to stop this crisis and ensure that every family, every individual has both the right to a safe and decent home and access to opportunity so that they can flourish as a human being. When I was working at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, so my first position out of law school, I worked with families who were living in homeless shelter. And I know I mentioned that I saw the direct effects of homelessness, but I often think about one of the very first clients that I worked with. They come back to me all the time. It was a young mom and two little kids. And they became homeless because they complained to the landlord about a hole in the roof. It was literally snowing and raining in their bedroom. And that retaliatory eviction led to them sleeping on the subway and sleeping outside and in cars and on people's floors. And they were sick. The kids were scared. They were really struggling. And every time I met with them, this little girl, the youngest, she would draw me pictures, often rainbows. She would hold my hand. One time she told me that she was my best friend in a little whisper, and it just, makes your heart swell in the way children do. Mm-hmm. And so here are these kids who for no fault of their own, their life is completely just taken out from under their feet. And one of the last times that I met with them, this little girl looked at me and she asked, "Are you really going to help us?" A 4-year-old little girl asked that question, and I couldn't answer her because the laws weren't in place. The rental assistance wasn't in place. The housing wasn't available. It was too late to go after that landlord and protect them from this harm. I couldn't answer that question in that moment. And so I hear her voice every day. Are you really going to help us? And the answer has to be yes. Every time it has to be yes.